members here to run this, and unfortunately, people sick, we don't. So we are recording this meeting so that it can be again if you would like to. So we're going to ask you to try to keep the conversations down to a it's distracting meeting, and I think that's it. I'm look very forward to learning a lot about offer. Shota?
Awesome. I hope everyone on Zoom can hear me. Okay, I can be really loud. Is that you hear good? Okay, perfect. All right, so I'm Shota from Tank Screen Stuff. I worked on a farm growing up, went to the University of Arizona to study agricultural economics, and I ended up for the U of A Compost Cats. And after the Compost Cats, I went to work for Green Valley Pecan, Arizona, which is the world's largest producer of pecans. And then along the way, Tank Screen Stuff, and I've been there for about the last 7 years. Before we get into the nitty gritty of the presentation, I'm going to play a quick video real quick. And good, cool. This is a Zoom issue, and the video doesn't have any audio. I'm just going to talk about the video real quick, who I am, what I'm doing. And these are videos from our Speedway landfill recycling facility, where we accept landscape trimmings and debris. A whole bunch of recycling materials. Aside from landscape trimmings, we do cardboard, plastic, construction debris. So compost kind of be when we're looking for a way to divert landscape trimmings from our landfills and recycling facility. The process in which we make compost is we grind it up using a big grinder, and we only use clean green materials. And then we lay it out into a windrow. We add organic dairy manure, element, and then turned. We also do regular testing and temperature take, sure that our windrows are nice and cooking at a proper temperature, making sure we're meeting all those Army listed organic certifications. And so this is to add into the turner or into the compost. That's the elemental sulfur we add in to use as sulfur. You can kind of see how hot and steamy the pile is. A little bit more in depth about it. About 3 weeks for us to turn the material in my right hand there into what looks like the left hand. And we compost much farther than that, a total 16 weeks in total before the product is considered finished. This is everyone's favorite bit. You know, we part science, part I just feel. Each windrow is an individual windrow, and all of them progress differently, so that we're in touch with what each windrow is doing and what their needs are. A lot of people call composting dirt farming, but we like to call it microbiology ranching, as we're trying to keep and thriving in our windrows to make the best possible compost that we can. At this point, that's kind of the big picture stuff that I wanted everybody. So I'm going to go ahead and pause this video, and we'll just jump right into the presentation. Today's presentation is about soil and where it starts. And obviously Shota from Tank's Green Stuff. Who here is familiar with soil? All right, everyone's had their hand in soil here a little bit. So soil health can benefit both us as gardeners as well as people of the earth in a lot of different ways. Reducing erosion, supporting a healthy ecosystem, soil's ability to hold water, improving water quality, having more resilient or increased yields, and more nutritious and flavorful crop. Soil, anybody? Well, I guess I already showed the slide. So it was made up of three main components. That's going to be organic material. And that's like your clay, sand, silt, rock. And then you have your living organisms, both your macro and moles and gophers, your microbiology, like your fungi, your bacteria, as well as your worms. And then amongst those three different properties, you're also got your, right? Water and air is key to healthy soil because just like us, aerobic environment or an environment with oxygen, the opposite of environment, an environment without oxygen, in which stuff starts to decay and rot, and you get that really smelly. And so our compost is an aerobic environment, which we are introducing oxygen to the microbiology on a regular basis to keep them happy, well aerated, and active. So that's kind of the big key three. Any questions on this? Okay. Okay. All right. So what makes soil? I'm going to take a second to move my table back. So like we briefly discussed, what makes a healthy soil is a balance between the chemical properties, the physical properties, biological properties of the soil, right? So we've got all three. You need chemical reaction, process and change nutrients in the soil. It's where things like capacity come to multiplication, and then properties, which is the microbiology, the fungi, the worms, etc. Okay. Functions of a healthy soil. My top three, right? A healthy soil is in composition. It's going to improve our water cycling quality. It's also going to build habitat. It's going to contribute to nitrogen and nutrient cycling and carbon cycling. Helps to manage or mitigate some of the effects of climate change, right? We sit now, something like 75% of the world's soil will be total. The soil's dead 50. Yeah. Okay.
You might have a mic problem there, Shota. It's really rough for all of us listeners. Just wanted to
Okay.
go and say that. This is Cesar Nogales. Nice to see you.
They can still hear and they can see the presentation. Okay. All right. We good to go? Okay, they're getting the audio. So soil organisms kind of break into two main categories. We've got your macroorganisms, those are your earthworms, beetles, ants, all those contribute to organic and part of a healthy environment and ecosystem in your garden. And then you have your microorganisms, my personal favorites, the heavy lifting at 10 stuff. You've got your algae, actinomycetes, protozoa, so on and so forth. Anybody know two lists here? No? Okay. All right. We'll move on to the next one. Rhizosphere, we'll get into a little bit, but not a whole lot. The rhizosphere is the immediate area around roots meet the soil, root zone. And that's where the nutrient transaction and the interactions between the soil to the plant happen, right? That little space right there is super tiny. The soil can be changed. The soil can be buffered by microbiology. That's where the chemical reactions and the handoff from microbiology to the roots. And so I like to think of it as kind of the busy zone where all the interactions, it's like the marketplace or the stock market, where all the microbiology are trading with the soil, for nutrients in the soil. So we touched on this a little bit earlier, but kind of the functions, right? And nutrient uptake. That's what healthy soil microbiology does. They're out there, they're like the worker bees, they're taking nutrients, processing, turning it into plant available nutrients and passing it along to the roots in the root zone, right? Out signals, form of what essentially is a sugar. They're saying out, hey, I want nitrogen, and that's a little bit of sugar, right? Ooh, food grabs that and says, what do you want for it? Right? And the plant's like nitrogen. They run off, find the nitrogen, get back to the roots, right? And that's how the microbiology works to facilitate nutrient uptake. Up next is harmful pathogens. When we're talking about microbiology and pathogens and pests, I like to think of them as you got really strong microbiology, you got a really strong immune system, you're going to thrive, you're going to deal better with stress, sickness. So having a really robust microbiology is just like having a really robust immune system. It's going to have a lot of issues. And the last one is an improved soil structure. So there are microbiology that exists that created, and that glue-like structures the soil and creates airspace for water and oxygen to flow through the stable in the soil. And it's just kind of like little bits of pieces of glue in the soil. So you can take the sand silting, start introducing organic material to it, and you start adding the microbiology to it, and slowly going to change into soil. All right. Any questions? Microbiology just exists in nature on its own. And by creating the right, letting it thrive and it needs, whether it's food, oxygen, or water, it will replicate and and exist on our hands. They exist on the plants. They exist on the roots. They exist in the air. Now I'm forgetting it, but there's a ridiculous number of like 30 million or 30 billion bits and pieces of microbiology, a teaspoon of soil, of healthy soil. So at tanks are kind of what we're doing with our product is to create healthy soil. Our goal is to achieve or is to maximize nature's ability to create healthy environments using nature's natural way of doing that. So just like the way that we have harnessed nature's ability to break down organic material to keep it out of the landfill and create compost, our goal is to do the same in the community by rebuilding the soils, allowing to grow food, plants, trees, shrubs, and flowers the way nature does without synthetic or, okay? So how to build healthy soil. So there's a number of ways to build. You're looking at, and you've bought a house, and a lot of houses in Tucson these days, there's nothing. Now that bare ground, native dirt, it's not existing soil. That is probably going to be graded dirt or imported dirt, right? And dirt, it technically is soil material that has been imported or moved is technically dirt. It's no longer. We all building our houses or living in spaces where we've got imported dirt that's no longer native soil, existing. So this way to let that happen naturally is to use mulch, and you can do and let take its course, and over time, over years or years of mulching, you're going to be able to change that soil, change that dirt from into soil. So you start out with your bare dirt, and boom, between the mulch and the dirt, you have your soil mulch interface. And where the two meet, water the ground, is going to filter down through the mulch into that soil mulch interface where it's going to be held. Soil microbiology going on, and there the soil microbiology starts to break down the mulch, and as it continues to rain, and that over time slowly transform that dirt into healthy soil just with the introduction of organic. It is a long, slow, and painstaking process. So yeah, it does. So it does help to organic material into the, so mulching and letting nature do it its way takes a long time, and I'll that time to do that. So if you're looking to do it a lot faster, it is as simple as incorporating that organic soil, establishing a more organic rich soil material. Our basic concept of changing dirt to soil, and you can see here I've got a little jar bottom. This is kind of for a planting situation. So we take our native soil, we then with a planting mix, depending on what you plan on growing. And so you've now changed that. We throw down a little, we put on top of that some composted fine mulch, and then on top of that decorative wood chips. For mimicking floor, you've got your organic material at the bottom that you've changed the soil with. So now you have a healthy soil. You're going to put the finest, the next finest stuff, and then the stuff that's least broken down or recently fallen from the forest. That's kind of how you force forward to change dirt into organic material. And the last thing is using bacterial or microbial inoculant or to enhance that process, making it go a lot faster and a lot smoother. So a couple of things that what not to do, using neonicotinoid, I can't say the word. Neonicotinoid coated seeds, right? Those are soil. They're going to disrupt that biology where those seeds are planted because they're designed to combat issues, bacterial issues in the soil. Another one is using pesticides, fungicides, and chemical fertilizer, right? Our goal is to avoid all agrochemical intervention because severely disrupt soil microbiology in the soil, right? There are definitely cases out there and where you got to spray, you got to hit it with something. It's too gnarly to deal with naturally. Like recently, I bought a house a few years ago, and there was some patches of Bermuda grass and planting. I started digging it up, but monsoon after monsoon, it became a real to the entire yard. I decided, you know what? I'm going to spray this 3 cubic foot or 3 square foot area in the corner of the yard before it spreads the yard, right? But then we're introducing chemicals, which isn't great. Or the existing biology there, which isn't great. So in the case where you do have to use agrochemical intervention at tanks, follow that up with some kind of bacterial or soil microconditioner, or sorry, or prebiotic fertilizer to reintroduce beneficial soil microbiology and enhance that soil microbiology to reestablish healthy soil in those areas. And that goes the same whether you're spraying on your plants, foliar, right? You got a pest issue, so you're going to spray it. Neem oil hasn't worked. The olive oil hasn't worked, and you're in danger of losing the entire yard, right? You're going to have to spray, right? Or cut everything down, right? Cayenne pepper, you've tried all those things, and now you're at your wit's end and you're like, we got to spray, right? When you spray, you're also ruining the microbiology that exists on the leaves of the plants, their microbiologies on the leaves that act like the microbiology on our skin, that protect the plants from pests and help it thrive. And so when you're doing the spray for that, you're disrupting that. So we also recommend using a foliar spray to reestablish and reintroduce and reinvigorate that native microbiology that exists. So wherever you spray, wherever you use, the key there is to hopefully not use it at all. But if you have to, start by reintroducing beneficial microbiology to rehabilitate the area. All right, a little pest myth busting. We get these questions all the time. I'm going to start with scorpions. Scorpions, right? People say, oh, bark mulches or woody mulches attract scorpions. So we did a study with the Sky Island High School a few years ago where we went out, we captured a whole bunch of scorpions and we put them in a bunch of different terrariums. Each terrarium had 4 zones. There was a kind of a stick and brick zone. There was a dirt zone, a rock zone, and a mulch zone. There are 4 zones in each of these terrariums. And the scorpions were most likely to be found in the stick and brick zones where there are big crevices for them to crawl up into and hide. And they were just as likely to be on the mulch, the rocks, or the dirt equally. But most likely they're looking for a place to hide, even though they're called bark scorpions. At least the most common scorpions in Arizona are called bark scorpions. They're not actually interested in bark. They're just looking for a little place to hide. So you're going to find them in brick walls, in wood piles, in loose bricks, opposed to in your mulch. The other one is termites, right? Termites will, I don't want to use mulch because it's going to attract termites. Well, woody mulches aren't food for termites. Termites are looking for big beams, 2x4s, dead timber, dead cactus, where they can tunnel in, create a home, create a space, create a nest. In a mulching material, there's not enough consistent material because it's always kind of changing. They're going out of one and into another because the particle sizes are too small, and they're not an attractant or a home or food for termites because termites eat to tunnel and tunnel to eat. So they're looking for a beam or tree or something to go into. So in conclusion, healthy soil is the foundation to a healthy urban farm or garden, and to grow healthy fruit trees or plants or shrubs. We like to imitate the forest floor, and that's kind of the presentation part of the presentation. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing that real quick. And then we kind of move towards the video side of the presentation. So hopefully the video works because it's not on the actual screen. Okay. All right, we'll see how this goes. This is kind of the materials and soil presentation part. And I guess I like this to be a little bit more question focused. So if you guys have questions, I'd rather answer those than talk about my products. So we'll start there. Anybody have any questions? Okay. Yes.
So I'm new to Tucson.
Okay.
Been up in the north.
Yeah.
And mycorrhizal
Mm-hmm.
in the soil is very common. Is that something that you find in the Tucson area?
So when we're talking about the soil that's in our backyards or that our houses are built on, no, not super common. But if you're talking about the enriched soil that you're using in your garden bed or in your in-ground garden or in your mulches or wood mulches around your trees, you'll find that naturally existing. If you're using, well, most organic or even non-organic materials will eventually develop that kind of microbiology in the soil. And the question was, do mycorrhizae naturally exist in the soil here in Tucson? And realistically, in most homes, it doesn't. Arizona, this desert Southwest in particular, generally has an organic material content of the soil in the native desert of like 2 to 5%. And so there's not a lot going on. There is stuff going on, but compared to back east or in other parts of the country, it's very minimal in terms of the kind of activity and the kind of organic material that's available in our native environments. But it does exist, just not probably in your backyard if you haven't put down any mulch or compost. All right. Yes. Yes.
How do you keep cats out of your dirt, or is it really bad?
How to keep cats out of the dirt. Pathogen.
Maybe I don't say it right.
No, oh, harmful pathogens. How to keep harmful pathogens out of the dirt.
Pardon me?
How to keep harmful pathogens out of the dirt.
Well, you shouldn't let cats in the dirt.
Yeah.
It has to avoid because they are
Yeah.
They're dropping.
Right. Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah. So cats
So
can carry.
we cannot have a garden unless it's totally fenced with wire.
I wouldn't go so far to say that. I think everyone can kind of take their own personal risk as to what they think is going to be I think that everyone can take their own kind of do their own risk analysis on how strongly they feel that it is a risk for them in their neighborhood or in their backyard or in their garden. You know, like at my house, we've got one cat and I'm not incredibly concerned. I've also got raised bed gardens at my house. So the cats aren't necessarily interested in digging in those beds. I guess it's kind of depends on how often you see cats in your bed and whether or not that's a real issue. Daily. Yeah.
And they don't reduce my raised bed, but I
Mhm.
cut them in a raised bed.
Yeah.
I haven't used it for vegetables anymore.
Okay. Well,
Okay, you're right. Give them a sandbox to go in.
yeah, if you give them an alternative area to go to the bathroom in that they prefer over the garden, then they'll use that area opposed to the area for your garden. So if you have like a sandbox or a kitty litter box that the cats are like, oh yeah, this is a much better place to go to the bathroom than your garden, then hopefully they won't go in your garden. Yes.
A very nice lady where I live feeds about 12 feral cats.
Okay.
Also captures them and some vet
Hmm.
takes care of the reproduction.
Yeah.
And I have problems with, the cats. And then planted Sunday
Hmm.
and Monday, they'd already started using the seed beds as, toilet. I talk to the cats. I tell them what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
We can communicate.
Hmm.
Try talking to the cats, explaining to them that I want food.
Yeah.
And I don't know.
I've seen
Yeah.
people have taken plastic forks and put the handle in the soil and have the fork sticking up.
Yeah.
And you put those in their garden beds until the plants get big enough where it's supposed to.
Yeah, once the plants are up, like, this high,
Right,
no problems.
right. But in beginning with your seeds,
Yeah, yeah.
it might be a deterrent.
For sure. I think the forks might work pretty good. Yeah. But ultimately, if your concern with the cats in your garden is them messing with your soil microbiology or introducing harmful pathogens to your garden, the best bet is the best strategy towards dealing with any kind of pathogen, bacterial or fungal pathogen is to outcompete that pathogen with beneficial microbiology. And so introducing organic compost or something like the super mix fertilizer that's designed to build healthy soil environments, or inoculating your garden with something like the Back to Feed microbial soil conditioner, or using the Agrigo Ultra prebiotic fertilizer, which is like a soil microbiology enhancer, where you're basically ramping up that existing or additional beneficial soil microbiology to 10. That will help to outcompete any of those harmful pathogens that might exist in your soil. So our best bet to fight bad pathogens in the garden bed, whether they're from cats or from other critters, is to simply outcompete them by providing nutrients, water, and food for the beneficial microbiology that exists in your soil. And by doing that, you can outcompete things like fecal chloroform, salmonella, or E. coli, right? That's what we do in our windrows, right? Fecal chloroform, salmonella, E. coli all exist in the air, exists in the cow manure that we use, or the dairy manure that you use in our compost, and come from the javelinas and the coyotes that come into our composting area at night. And what we do to combat that is simply make sure that we're maximizing the native or the beneficial soil microbiology's ability to thrive and outcompete any of the negative or less ideal pathogens or microbiologies in the soil. Okay, yeah.
So in Tucson, the soil is often alkaline.
Yeah.
A lot of plants are alkaline. A lot of the vegetable garden stuff wants things a little more balanced, a little more acid.
Right.
How do you regulate the acid out and balance?
Oh, yeah. Fabulous question. All right. This is where the rhizospheric. Okay. So the question was, how do we deal with our alkaline environment, right? Southern Arizona, Tucson specifically, the water is alkaline. The soil or the dirt is alkaline. The feedstocks, the landscape debris, the organic materials, the plants, anything that we make our compost out of is alkaline, right? So at Tank Screen Stuff, our compost generally tests around 8, a pH of 8, right? And that's why we add elemental sulfur to our compost. It's an organic ingredient that, when broken down by the beneficial microbiology, turns into something like elemental, or that turns into something like sulfuric acid, not sulfuric acid, but like sulfuric acid. It can drop the pH of our compost by 1 to 1.5 points, right, after installation. So, like, for example, our raised bed garden mix goes into a garden at like 8 pH. Tested 4 weeks later, it'll drop to 7.5. Tested 16 weeks later, it'll be at like 7.2, 7.1, right? And what we're doing, at least with the compost, is we've given the compost the necessary ingredients to change the pH of that soil. So in an alkaline environment like ours, where everything's alkaline, one of the best tips and tricks is to do rainwater harvesting, right? If you're watering with the rainwater, you're introducing water that is less mineral rich, that has a lower pH, and helps to create a healthier, happier garden. Now, aside from rainwater harvesting, the soil microbiology has the ability to change the pH in the soil in the rhizosphere. And we touched on the rhizosphere a little bit earlier. So by managing and improving and increasing your soil microbiology and your soil health, you can then in turn change the pH for the plants, because the plants will send out signals saying, hey, the pH is a little bit high here, and we're just not really loving it, right? And the soil microbiology gets that message, and they start changing the soil pH in the rhizosphere. So by giving the soil microbiology the necessary tools and ingredients and materials it needs to change that, you can then change the soil microbiology in your garden. Now, the other side of this is pH and the fixation of gardeners, farmers on pH. Does anyone have any idea why pH is something that is so often talked about?
Well, plants thrive better at certain pH.
Right, and it's not that they thrive better at most pH ranges. It's that chemical nutrients, or the raw, synthetic, or naturally existing chemical like nitrogen for tomatoes, right? Tomatoes absorb not raw nitrogen, but the plant available nitrogen best at pHs from like 6.5 to 7, right? You can Google any plant and say, what's the best pH range? And that pH range simply refers to the best range in which that plant will absorb the plant available NPK, right? So it's not that tomatoes won't grow, right? We know that tomatoes will grow in a soil of pH of 8. But if you go online and say, hey, what's the best soil pH? They're going to say 5 to 7. And so that pH obsession kind of stems from the use of chemical fertilizers, because chemical fertilizers are best absorbed at those specific pH ranges. So if you're not relying on chemical fertilizers to feed your plants, the pH is less of something that needs to be fixated on. There's obviously plants out there in the world, specifically one like blueberries, where they really struggle with high pH or alkaline soils. And there are definitely ones out there that are a real tough go with high pH water and high pH soils. But the vast majority of plants can be grown outside of those typical pH ranges if you're relying on organic process to deliver that nutrients to the plants, opposed to the chemical process to deliver that nutrients to the plants, right? Like I like to think of conventional chemical fertilizers like an IV drip. You're just putting it in the plant, right? Every week, every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, you're out there spraying that Miracle Grow juice and the plants are thriving. They're looking happy, right? At the same time, you're deteriorating the soil microbiology, but it doesn't matter. They're not doing anything for you. You got fungicides and insecticides that will help you protect those plants when everything goes haywire, right? Organically, it's like eating food. Eat the food, let your stomach digest it. The stomach is your soil microbiology. They process it, break it down, and send it out to your fingers. And boom, you got energy, you're growing, your nails look beautiful, right? So that's kind of the difference between the two different types of fertilizers and the two different concepts of growing. You have your organic and your conventional, and where organic is concerned, pH is less of an issue and it shouldn't be fixated on as much, because just by building healthy soil, just having that robust soil microbiology can mitigate a lot of those issues. In the same way that when you're growing organically, you can mitigate a lot of those pathogen issues because you've got a strong immune system and a strong functioning soil that's the foundation for your plants. All right. That was an awesome question. Did I answer it okay for you? All right. That's one of my favorite ones to answer. Yeah. Yeah, let's hit him.
First one is, how much compost do you recommend for a typical garden each year?
Okay. All right. This is a perfect opportunity to break open a bag of our Tank Screen Stuff organic compost. Now, who else has bought a bag of compost at the store recently? Something else? No? Only buy tanks. All right. Well, then you guys all know that this bag weighs 45 pounds, right? And that a bag of Tank Screen Stuff compost is much denser than our competitors' compost. And when it comes to using our compost, it can't be planted in directly. It's too mineral rich, it's too nutrient rich, it's just too dense to be planted in directly, and must be used as a soil amendment as compost is designed to be used. We don't add anything to this bag aside from the compost that comes out of the windrows, goes through the trommel screen, and then gets put in this bag by the lovely 3 gentlemen that do all of our bagging. So it's super fine, super rich, super dense. So when it comes to our compost at Tank Screen Stuff, we probably recommend using maybe 1 or 2 inches in a given season. A few years ago, or 2 years ago, we do a lot of work with the Tucson Village Farm, and every year they order a truckload of our compost, right? And every year they have been religiously putting down 2 to 3 inches of compost in their garden beds. And the garden beds went from 6 inches below to 6 inches above ground, right? And they said, hey, these lab tests are showing that we've got too much NPK in our garden and it's messing with our seedlings, right? And I said, well, how much compost have you been adding every year? And they're like, well, we've been doing 2 to 3 inches. And now we're like 3 feet or 6 inches above where we were at grade. So the moral of the story with the compost is generally speaking, if your garden settles this much during a growing season, add 1 inch. If it settles this much during a growing season, add 3 inches. Obviously, when you get to 3 inches, that's a lot of compost to be adding to the garden without any other amendments. So generally at above 2 inches, we recommend you move over to another mix like this, which is our raised bed mix. Right, and this mix here is our Super Pro planting mix, specifically designed for raised bed gardens. And there's other products on the market that you can choose from. But when you're going to add more than 1 inch or 2 of compost, we highly recommend going to a planting mix opposed to just adding compost. At least with our mix, you're going to get cocoa core, you're going to get perlite, and you're going to get cocoa chip, which are going to add air, drainage, aeration, and water holding capacity to the soil. And our goal whenever we're adding anything to a garden bed is to create a homogeneous soil, right? We don't want to have 2 inches of really good stuff and 6 inches of stuff that's a decade old, right? We want to have a nice mix throughout that root zone so the plants are more likely to send their roots down. We want them to feel comfortable and confident all the way down through the root zone that they're going to have good material all the way. Okay? Yeah. Yes. If the garden has gotten so low that you've got to add that much material. Usually in any given season, I'll throw in like 1 or 2 inches. Obviously, I get this stuff all the time, so it's pretty easy for me to come across it and be like, well, I should just throw a little bit in right now because I've got it in the truck. But if that's not the case, then adding what's gone down is basically you're looking to replace the organic material that's broken down over the course of the growing season to replace what has gone to the plants, gone to the oxygen or the air or the water or flown out with the water. Yeah, you want to basically, you would kind of want to make sure that anytime you add anything to the garden, that you're not creating layers and that you're creating a nice homogeneous mix throughout the root zone. And that's a good rule of thumb anytime. So if you're someone who's like, well, I don't really want to till, right? And the reason tilling is not great is because it disrupts that soil microbiology. So that gives you kind of 2 options. The first option is that you can just put something like a planting mix down instead of a compost and just send it, see how it goes. In theory, if every year you're adding the same planting mix, then in theory, you're going to have a relatively homogeneous mix that's not too crazily out of bounds. The other option is to add little bits of compost on a regular basis. And so you're only disrupting the top couple of inches of your garden on a regular basis. The third option is, well, you know what, we really got to dig deep and we got to add a whole bunch of material. So what we recommend is whenever installing a new garden or adding significant amounts of material to an existing garden, as you go back through and you inoculate with either a microbial soil conditioner or use a prebiotic fertilizer to re-establish and enhance that soil microbiology. Like we sell a product called AgriGrow Ultra, and there's lots of other products out there that do a similar thing. But we found that with the AgriGrow Ultra, you basically get to ramp up that soil microbiology in a couple of weeks over waiting the 8 to 16 months it normally takes for organic material or for soil microbiology to reestablish itself in the soil. So I do the AgriGrow Ultra all the time. It's a relatively cheap amendment and it goes a long ways in terms of maintaining really good soil health and letting the plants deal with stress. So like one example is tomatoes, right? Anywhere above like 90 degrees, tomatoes start to drop their flowers. They stop producing. They really struggle. I had 2 garden beds this summer, one that I was treating with AgriGrow Ultra, one that I wasn't. And it's not a great comparison because they were not necessarily right next to each other. But the one, and this is the second season in a row, where the ones treated with the AgriGrow Ultra tend to produce tomatoes longer and farther into the heat season because they are more comfortable and less stressed out than their counterparts, because the soil microbiology is reducing that stress or the plant's ability to deal with that stress, which means they're not dropping their flowers because the dropping of the flowers is a stress symptom. So the plants get stressed out, they drop the flowers. All right, any other questions? Yeah, so this is compost, cocoa peat, cocoa chip, perlite, and some of our super mix organic fertilizer. So it's designed to be planted in directly, or you can take it home by the bag and mix it with your native soil to enhance your native soil to create your own garden blend. All right, other question?
Travel for decades. More mission to mulch. It sounds like wood mulching it all and then using your layer cake method in the areas that are prioritizing planting the way you go. Yes?
Yeah. So our first step to rehabilitating a huge area is to mulch the whole thing. One thing about mulching, especially if you're also using that mulch for a weed suppression, is to layer it at least 3 inches. And we personally prefer to recommend cardboard as an undersheet opposed to a weed cloth. What the cardboard does in the short term is it gives you a layer in which seeds and plants can't come up through the cardboard. But long term, as it breaks down, it's just going to turn into more organic material, where if you use a weed cloth or some kind of sheet, that's obviously just going to turn into little bits of microplastics in your yard in a couple of years. And so we always recommend cardboard and then at least 3 inches. And then they're right on top of it. Then amend locally where you want to plant right away. You can start by adding compost or planting mix to the native soil, depending on what you're planning on planting. To mulch them? Yeah. Yeah, rainwater harvesting basins and creating those basins where water traps and filters down the soil is going to have a drastic impact on that rainwater harvesting area, but it's also going to spread out wider than just that single area, as that water will hold in that area and the soil will change, not only in depth, but horizontally from that same spot.
I've read 1/4 of an inch of compost a year is sufficient for a garden. That, you know, if you want deep rooted vegetables, you probably need 6 to 8 inches, you know, if you're gonna grow.
Of root zone? Of healthy root zone?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you said 2 inches.
Well, I'm talking about what you put on top of your existing soil. Yeah, so you can use 1/4 inch if that's all your garden demands, right? And how you gauge what your garden needs every season is just kind of how far that soil settles between growing seasons. So if your soil started out at a total depth of 10 inches, and by the time September rolls around, you're at 9.5 inches, then yeah, all you really need to add is a 1/2 inch. But if that soil drops to 8 inches, then you might have to add 2 inches of material. The goal is to kind of add what's lost over the course of the growing season. And that could be anywhere from 1/4 inch to whatever it might be, depending on your garden and your situation. The key there is to add as needed.
Is there a way to break down leaves fallen on a gravel lawn so that one does not have to rake them up or use a leaf blower? And what Eric trying, can you use the crushing or EM to help break the leaves down in situ? It's hard to rake leaves from gravel without mixing the gravel and the leaves that you would add to the compost pile.
Yeah, there's not a great way to break down. Okay. All right. Is there a way to break down leaves fallen on a gravel lawn so that one doesn't have to rake them up or use a leaf blower? In our arid climate, can you use bokashi or EM to help break down leaves down into situ? It's hard to rake leaves from gravel without mixing the gravel in with the leaves that you would like to add to the compost piles. There's not a really good way to break down leaves on top of gravel, unfortunately. Things like EM and bokashi require moisture. And when you have rocks, there isn't any moisture to feed the microbiology, in turn feed the plants, or feed the microbiology to break down the leaves. So if you have leaves on top of rocks, the best way to break down the leaves is to put mulch on top of the rocks, which, you know, kind of exactly. So there's not a great way to do that, unfortunately. Things like EM require moisture, and usually that's done in a container. So if you can take the leaves and put them in a container, then yeah, you can break them down, but that doesn't solve the leaves on top of the rocks issue.
EM. You say EM?
EM. Yeah, it's another kind of process for breaking down organic material. I don't remember what exactly it stands for. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. EM is effective microorganisms. Yes,
When you get the hot sheet, it's a non-oxygen anaerobic.
right.
It's a container.
Hmm.
I did it at school once.
Yeah.
And they might be doing it at Miles right now. I'm not
Mhm.
sure if they used to.
Yeah. So yes, it's an anaerobic way of breaking down organic material. So it wouldn't work for this application either. Yeah.
I have some sulfur that looks like lentil, little round circles.
Yep.
Do I have to mash that, or how does that get into the soil?
You just sprinkle a little bit on. And the microbiology will break it down as the water will also break it down and spread it out throughout. But that's elemental sulfur. So that's like the raw form of sulfur. So you can just spread it out and sprinkle it in the garden as recommended.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The steep beans all just stay on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes when I dig there, there's a lot of white stuff.
Mm-hmm.
What's that?
That is probably actinomycete, which is a fungus like bacteria that is a sign of decomposition. It's beneficial. Yes. I recommend IAS labs for soil testing. So if you're looking to get your soil tested, it's very important that you have a regional lab do that. The only one in Arizona that we recommend is IAS labs in Phoenix or Tempe, or maybe it's Phoenix, but they're very good. And the reason I recommend IAS labs and using a regional lab is if you send a lab test for an Arizona garden to somebody in the Midwest, they're going to look at that lab test and say, well, you should buy a new house somewhere else because you are not growing anything in that soil, right? And the number of times that I've gone out to someone's house or gotten a lab test from somebody who's gotten their lab test from somebody out of Illinois, lab test comes back and they're like, this is out of whack, 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 right? Take that very same lab test, send it to the agronomist at IS Labs. What do you think? Oh, well, everything looks pretty good. I'd say that they might need a little extra iron and perhaps just a touch of phosphorus, right? You send your pH and your EC over to the Midwest, they're going to freak. They're going to be like, whoa, right? And we all know that stuff still grows out here. Everyone's growing stuff and everyone's being relatively successful. But that lab out wet or out back east is just, they're not going to know how to comprehend the lab tests in the soil out here or make any meaningful recommendations on what you should do to improve your garden.
I have a question about managing compost piles.
Yeah.
Are there big temperature indicators that you look for, and what do you do there?
Yeah. So with our OMRI certification and the guidelines set by the USDA for organic compost, we're required to keep our windrow temperatures at above 131 degrees Fahrenheit to a top temperature of at least 160. I have a threshold of 150. So we like to keep it between 131 and 150, right? Temperature in a compost windrow or pile is not an indication of stuff breaking down. It is simply an indication of activity, right? Just like us, if we're in a gymnasium, the gymnasium's cooled down to 72 degrees, 200 people go in there to watch a basketball game, that temperature is going to rise, right? Same thing happens in a windrow. All those microbiology is going to be respirating. They're going to be breathing. They're going to be putting off heat. And that's what creates the temperature in a compost pile. And so at tanks, we're at 131 to 150, a minimum of 15 days with 5 turns. That's our required amount of composting to certify a product as organic. Now we do 131 to 150 for about 90 days, sometimes up to 120 days. And when the temperature gets above 150 degrees and gets closer to 160, you start killing off the beneficial microbiology. We're no longer in that happy range of the most productive biology we want in our windrows. And at that point, we turn. So we saw in the video at the beginning, we saw that turner and all that steam coming out, right? So we release the heat out of the pile. We're introducing oxygen and moisture, and that's how we manage temperatures in our windrows. And so, but for most home composting applications, it's very unlikely that you'll meet those temperatures to make sure that you're composting at an ideal level. And so it's a very good idea at home not to put anything in the compost that you might think or you think will lead to harmful pathogens in your garden. So although all organic materials like meat, dairy, cheese, yogurts are compostable, they're not ideal for the home composting because they're more likely to lead to harmful pathogens in the garden down the road. That's a good question. Did I answer it all right? Okay.
Quick ones. What did you use to spray on the Bermuda?
I used a little brown bottle. Yeah, I used a little brown bottle that was a lot smaller and a lot more expensive than everything else at Ace Hardware. And I think if you ask the Ace Hardware people for the little brown bottle of Bermuda Killer, they'll be able to find it for you. And I mean, I like literally used like 1 tablespoon of it in like a gallon or something. And I didn't even use the whole gallon. Like I used like a quarter of the gallon, but I did that, I think, twice. And I managed to contain it in that area. And then I solarized it and then added mulch and compost back to it.
Shells and compost.
Eggshells are good.
Okay. So my raised bed is now layered against your recommendation. Would it be hard for me to dig all the way down and mix, or do you have any ideas?
So it depends on how layered it is, right? Our ultimate goal for a garden bed, root zone, right? We want the roots to have somewhere between 10 and 24 inches, depending on the variety of plants. So if your layers are like 10 inches of good soil and then 2 feet of really crappy stuff, not a big deal, right? Most of those plants are going to do okay in that top 10 inches. Now, if you've got 3 inches of this stuff, 2 inches of this stuff, 4 inches of this stuff, and 5 inches of this stuff, that's a little bit crazier, a little bit wilder, and it's probably best to mix it up or just let things be, plant things, see how it goes, and next time around, try a little bit more to keep things homogenized.
Go back to the eggshells.
Yeah.
Does anybody know, had their soil tested here, just, the regular soil, go out there?
Mhm.
Calcium, how much calcium is in the soil here?
Usually more than enough.
There's plenty of calcium.
There usually is enough calcium in the soil. The only places where I'd recommend additional calcium application, where you want to maybe use the eggshells or a calcium substitute, is going to be in the container plots. So where you're not using the native soil, or in garden beds where you're growing stuff like, what is it? Squash or eggplant or zucchini, where you have common issues with blossom end rot.
There's other cations in the soil.
Mhm.
And if calcium is not in balance with magnesium,
Right.
the soil is going to be like this.
Yep.
So by adding the calcium to the soil that I believe is here without ever paying for a $75 soil test.
Yeah.
Telling somebody that, yeah, it's okay, but I would be careful with how that balance is. Because you want the tilt to be there, and if the cations are right, I don't care how much organic material you add to it.
Yeah, I would refrain from putting all the eggshells in one container, but in your compost at home and you're just making compost at home, throwing the eggshells in the compost aren't going to have an incredibly detrimental effect.
I've never found all the places I live that you can get calcium too.
Yeah, usually if you're using some amount of native soil, calcium generally isn't an issue, but like I have containered zucchinis, I think this summer, or no, eggplants, and they got blossom end rot early in the season with all the moisture and humidity. And I wasn't sure if it was moisture or if it was a calcium deficiency, but I did add calcium to the containers because there's no native soil in those containers, right? Those are all potting mixes. So it's just a blend of compost, cocoa peat, and perlite. So depending on what you're doing and where you're doing, you might be interested in adding calcium to things depending on the soil. But you're right. Like if it's an in-ground garden, it's highly unlikely that you need any calcium amendments at all. But
Always bake the eggshells,
mhm,
just to make sure there's no pathogens or whatever.
for sure.
And then I put it in the blender.
Yeah. And that's a great way to make a little
Pulverize.
spread. Mhm.
I've always done that with my tomatoes, just because.
Yeah.
the phosphate raw.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's like, that's definitely more of a container situation than it would be like an in-ground situation to use calcium.
Eggshells are 98% calcium.
Yeah.
It's a lot of calcium to be added to.
Felt the same way online too. You made comments.
Yeah.
And some clarification, so that's good. In the shade, should it be under a tree outside?
Ideally, the biggest issue with home composting, backyard composting in exposed atmosphere in Tucson is going to be moisture retention. So you're better off in the shade than you are in the sun, just because the more water and the more moist, obviously you don't want to make it soupy, but the more moisture you have in your compost pile, with ideal moisture being 55% for maximum breakdown, you're generally going to struggle maintaining that moisture. So a shady spot is going to work much better than a sunny spot.
I've had good success with covering the piles in the tar.
Mm-hmm.
Rains, the tar off.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah, that's always a good bet there.
So I have a quick question.
Yeah. Coffee
on
grounds?
plants, coffee grounds on plants or in a compost pile or in for cactus or any plant?
Yeah, so I've got this problem at home where the compost bin is too far away from the back door. So the coffee grounds go right into the garden bed, and we try to rotate which garden beds the coffee grounds go into. So you can do that. You can throw them in the compost. I don't think it really makes a huge difference. I think if you can put it in the compost of the garden opposed to the trash, whatever's easiest for you is the way you should go and do it.
So now I think we've got a lot of the questions done.
Okay.
So they want to know more about your products there.
Okay. All right. We'll kind of move on to the product. So we saw the compost, right? Compost is kind of the backbone of our product line. And then at tanks, we use a lot of pumice, perlite, and we don't use a whole lot of vermiculite, mostly because it's super expensive. But these are aeration materials. So like we talked about earlier, aeration and drainage is really important to keeping roots and microbiology happy. So these are going to be your aeration ingredients. Yes.
Which of those are mine?
They're all mined. So pumice is naturally expanded silica that comes from a pumice mine. These two here are artificially expanded or expanded at a production facility where basically they introduce hot steam in a sense to puff or popcorn the silica into these two materials. And all three of these are mined. These two are produced in Arizona. This one comes out of a pumice mine in New Mexico, which is unfortunately the closest place we can find pumice. So aeration and drainage, it's pretty straightforward. So you'll find those in stores. Depends on the application. Oh, which one works the best? It depends on the application, right? So things like our cactus mix and our houseplant mix, we like the pumice. Pumice is much denser and heavier, so it doesn't float as much. It's also a bigger particle size, so it creates bigger pockets of airspace in the soil mix. The perlite we use in all of our kind of potting mixes and seeding mixes, mostly because it's a lighter weight, so it doesn't add to the density of the material. It also is smaller and cheaper, so it's less expensive towards the final customer for the product. So aeration and drainage. And then at tanks, we use cocoa peat. This is Pro Cocoa, which is owned by the same gentleman that owns EcoGrow. This is his company. So it's a locally based company that we partnered with for our cocoa core needs. And at tanks, we only use cocoa peat. We don't use any of the traditional peat products like Dakota peat or sphagnum peat or peat moss. We just use cocoa core. And the biggest reason we use cocoa core is because it comes to us dry in a block, right? When you add this to water, it expands 2.5 cubic foot or 5-fold of what it is here now. What that means is that in an environment like Arizona, where you're bound to dry out the plants, the cocoa peat can be rehydrated over and over and over again, right? We've all gone and bought a plant at the store, forgotten to water it. The peat-based mix dries out and the soil shrinks up in the container. And then we go to take it and put under the kitchen sink and the water runs right through it, right? Once peat moss, Dakota peat loses its moisture, it no longer has the ability to hold moisture, right? And that threshold is generally somewhere around 15 to 20% moisture. So it's pretty easy to dry out a plant. And once you dry out that soil, it's basically useless. You're not going to have the same moisture holding capacity, which means you're not going to have the same microbiology going on and being active in that. And that's why we use cocoa core, because you can rehydrate it over and over again. A couple of the perks to cocoa core is that it lasts longer, so it doesn't degrade or break down as quickly. It also is arguably more sustainable as it's a byproduct from the coconut industry. So the cocoa juices, jellies, waters, and almond joys, what do they do with the coconut husks? Some of it gets pushed into the ocean, some of it gets burned, some of it gets put in a landfill, and some of it we get to put in our gardens. And so that's why. So yeah, so this is ground up coconut husk. And then over here, we've got our cocoa chip, which is a big chunkier piece of cocoa core. And we'll talk a little bit more about that down the road. Up next. Oh, and by the way, all of you present today here in the room, I leave all these here. These do not go in back in my truck. So, you know, I hope you brought your fighting shoes, brought a strong jaw, because I'm leaving these behind and they're up for grabs. Yeah, and if there's a time constraint, you can just let me know. We don't have to go through everything. Okay. 15 minutes, 10, 15. Okay, perfect. All right. So this is the cactus and succulent mix that we make. I don't know if you all can see it, but it's much chunkier, right? A lot of times when I do this presentation at like an Ace Hardware, I'll buy a bag of whatever cactus mix they've got on the shelves. And when I open that bag, it is just a bag of dried peat. Our mix is super chunky. We use the cocoa chip and the pumice in our cactus mix. These two don't break down very quickly, which means you get really long-lasting soil that stays in the container upright, so that plant doesn't sink down in the container, which means the roots aren't being compressed into the soil, which means when you water, the water goes through the container opposed to suffocating the roots. At the same time, these chunks of cocoa chip hold moisture, right? So if I give it a really good squeeze, there'll be water coming out of it. So the beauty of it is that it really provides great aeration and drainage. So you're never going to have that root rot that you get with other mixes. At the same time, there's always moisture available to the plants. Yeah.
Flowers, cactus plants.
Mhm.
Okay in the compost pile?
Fine, yeah.
Just wondered that.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, our cactus flowers okay in the compost pile. And yes, they are. The one thing I don't recommend adding to the compost pile are the cactus themselves, as the glaucids and thorns don't break down. So we don't put any of the mixed debris, which is cactus palm, in our compost piles, because it just doesn't break down at the same rate as everything else does. And I like to garden with my hands, I assume most people do. So we don't use any of that in our compost. So the same kind of trick goes for our houseplant mix. Most common issue with houseplants is drainage, aeration, and usually overwatering. So our goal with both of these mixes is to take the survivable window of your plants from here to here. So if you're an overwater, no problem. We got tons of drainage. If you're an underwater, not a big deal. That cocoa chip's going to have moisture for you. So that's kind of the key of the success of both of these mixes. Yeah. Indoor, yes, you could use the Della Tank's houseplant mix. Depending on the herbs and your lighting, you might be able to get away with like a nicely aerated potting mix. But these two are this is designed for houseplants or for indoor growing. Now, let's see. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, so this cactus mix is designed for containers, but you can also use it to amend the native soil within reason, right? Most cactus are going to be just fine with just the native soil. And there are definitely some varieties out there where you shouldn't use any amendments at all when planting. But the Tucson Botanical Garden uses this for all their cactus and succulents. They recently planted a whole bunch of, I think, either organ pipes or totem poles, and they put about 20% cactus mix in the soil when they were planting those. So it really kind of depends on the variety, but you can use it for both in-ground and cactus or in containers. But yeah, the Desert Botanical Garden and the Tucson Botanical Garden buy this mix by the truckload. All right, up next, we've got our Tanks Pro Light Seeding and Potting Mix. So now that fall season's coming around, this is our seeding and potting mix. 3 ingredients: compost, cocoa peat, perlite. We only use a dash of compost in this, as younger plants and seedlings don't need as much nutrient material or nutrients availability. And so the little bit of compost that we put in there will get those plants to the point where they're ready to transplant. We focus in this mix on using more cocoa peat. The cocoa peat gives us better moisture retention. The smaller the container, the faster the soil is going to dry out. So the more moisture retention you have, the better. Up next is going to be our potting mix, which is our kind of 5 to 10 gallon general purpose potting mix. This is for your flowers, your herbs, your veggies. It's also, this one's an OMRI listed product. It's got cocoa peat, compost, and perlite, the very same 3 ingredients that's used in this mix, but you'll notice this doesn't have the OMRI listed certification. Because me, myself, and I handle all the OMRI certifications, not all of our products are OMRI listed organic, but are all made with organic ingredients. So we don't use any chemical dyes, additives, or anything to our products. OMRI, OMRI, the Organic Materials Research Institute, which is the governing body of our organic certification. Thank you for asking. But yeah, so this is our potting mix. And then earlier, we briefly had a look at this, the raised bed mix. So once you get out of kind of your 5 to 10 gallon container size, we recommend going to the raised bed planting mix, mostly because that mix is cheaper. It's also got cocoa chip and a little bit more perlite in it, so it drains a little bit better and it holds up to that density. The bigger the container you get, the more moisture you have, which means that mix gets compressed more. So the bigger the container, the more aeration and drainage it's better to have in that soil mix, as the soil tends to compress. But it's a good time to talk about density. I know a lot of people like good soil feel, right? We want it to feel fluffy. We want it to feel light. We want it to feel good, right? But that is not always the most concerning or important thing, right? The biggest factor of whether or not your soil has got good density or is compact or not is going to be drainage. Does the water drain, right? As long as the water drains, I wouldn't worry about the soil hardening up. Usually when the top layer of a garden hardens up, that's because of a combination of things. One of them is lack of moisture. And as it dries out, it hardens. And that is just the result of the native soil here. Once it dries out, it hardens up. The other one is that in that top layer of the garden bed, you're going to have accumulated salts and minerals. So of course, as it dries out, that's also going to contribute to the hardening of that top layer of soil. But just because you can't get your fingers into the garden bed doesn't necessarily mean that soil is no good. It doesn't necessarily mean that the roots are not going to be happy, right? Because roots are incredibly powerful and have the ability to break through that. But if you're concerned about the top of that garden bed hardening, the number one thing you can use to mitigate that is going to be mulch. right? Using mulch is going to keep moisture in that top zone of the garden bed, and it's going to keep that top layer of soil from hardening up because it's going to stay moist. So we've got our two different mulches here. This is the decorative wood chips, and we've got our composted fine mulch. Now it tanks. We accept landscape trimmings, as you guys are aware, and then we hand pull and hand sort the logs, and we stack them up separately, and we grind them and regrind them, or grind them and then screen them. So this is our small decorative wood chips here. Try not to make a mess. Made a mess, okay. And these we generally recommend for established plants, pathways, and shrubs. So you want to use the decorative wood chips anywhere where you're not going to be planting anytime soon, right? For garden beds, containers, things like that. Oh, I've opened the wrong bag. That's the potting mix. We recommend for garden beds the composted fine mulch, which hopefully looks like this, right? This composted fine mulch is a byproduct of our composting process. So we start out with a 2-inch grinding for our compost. When we screen out the oversized pieces, we take those oversized pieces, we regrind and rescreen it, which means this material is inoculated with the same beneficial microbiology as our compost. It's free of pathogens, it's free of weeds, and because it's a smaller particle size and inoculated with the beneficial microbiology, when used in a garden bed with regular irrigation, it's going to break down over the course of an average growing season, which means when you use the composted fine mulch, you can just kind of work it into the soil, throw down some super mix, maybe a little compost, plant. When you use the decorative wood chips, you're going to have to pull the wood chips away, amend the soil, plant, and then put the wood chips back. And so the composted fine mulch is a really great material. I use it in all the raised bed gardens. I find that it really stabilizes the soil temperature. One of the biggest issues with raised bed gardens is soil temperature. Like 90% of my, well, I shouldn't say that. 50% of my house calls tend to be irrigation issues, right? Most people are either watering by hand and are not watering enough, or they're watering with an irrigation system and they're watering too little, too often, right? They're watering 4 or 5 times a day, 5 minutes at a time, right? Something ridiculous like that. So mulch goes a long ways into keeping that moisture in the garden. And then the second most common issue I have that I run into when I go to visit customers' houses is that they've got a raised bed garden. And we take the soil thermometer and we put it in that raised bed garden. Raised bed garden. Ambient temperature 78 degrees, it's 2 degrees, right? In-ground temperature 65 degrees, right? Doesn't matter where in the yard we put that thermometer, that soil temperature is going to be 65 degrees. So in a raised bed garden here in Arizona, where we might have a low of 45 and then a high of 85, and you see a 40-degree temperature change, that livestock tank raised bed garden is also experiencing that temperature change, right? Which means the roots are experiencing that temperature change. We've all seen on the back of the packets for any seed a given soil temperature that's best for planting, right? Because soil temperature slowly warms up over the course of the year and slowly cools down, right? It's never like this. So one of the most common issues we have with raised bed gardens here in Arizona is the temperature does go like this, right? So earlier this year, we had freezing. 6 days later, it was above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you planted young plants before the freeze, and then it freezes, and then 5 days later, it's 90 degrees, that plant has had a heck of a go, and the soil and the root zone is also had a heck of a go. So I recommend keeping that in mind when you're working with raised bed gardens. They are more sensitive because the raised bed garden is not only exposed on the soil surface, but all the way around. So insulating them, like I use livestock tanks, which aren't great. I don't like recommending them because they tend to be more finicky when it comes to temperature, but I insulate them. I use some insulation material on the inside, or you can use insulation material on the outside, or use bricks, or ideally not railroad ties, but something of that thickness to insulate the soil. But just keep that in mind. That's always one of the big ones that comes up as a common issue. But using things like mulch can help mitigate and manage some of those issues. And same with having a healthy soil microbiology. can help those plants deal with stress. Last couple things I'm going to throw out there is our Buds cannabis product line. We spent a year and a half developing this, and this is specifically for cannabis or special tomatoes, as I like to call them. And we have 3 different mixes that we've had on the market now for over a year. We don't advertise them a whole lot because in the first year, we were just trying to get customer feedback. When the mixes were tested and developed, they were tested by commercial professional growers, which is different from home growers. So real quick here, we've got our Buds Super Soil here. Super Soil, it's like a potting mix, just specifically designed for cannabis or hemp. And you can plant in it cannabis, hemp, or whatever else you might have. And then we've got our Buds Basic Cocoa Mix, which, as the name suggests, is a basic mix of just cocoa peat and perlite. No microbiology, no amendments, nothing. Zilch, zero, zap. Just cocoa peat and perlite. This is your blank canvas. So traditionally, outdoor growers have used soil, indoor growers use chemical fertigation and like hydroponics-like system, right? In recent years, when people are starting to grow more and more at home and they're more concerned about what they're consuming, we've developed the Super Cocoa Mix for those people who want to use organic ingredients, but grow indoors using things like compost tea or fish emulsions or kelp meal. And that's the Buds product line. So that's everything I got. Okay.
To help with organic gardening and farming, is Tank's looking into other packaging materials rather than the plastic?
Yeah, the plastic packaging is not great. I'll be the first to admit that. I really don't like them. It would be nice if there was a bio or like a compostable alternative that was quick and relatively inexpensive. But there's not. Being that the material sits out in the sun, seeing that the material has living organisms on the inside, we haven't found a suitable packaging alternative yet. I do have a lead at the moment on like cloth kind of fiber bags, and we're looking to experiment with that and try and offer some of our products in non-plastic bags. Unfortunately, we also offer it in bulk. So the big part about if you really don't want to use the plastic bags, which I totally understand, is to come buy it in bulk, right? For example, a bag of our organic compost generally retails at $9.99. You can buy it by the cubic yard for $50. So say you come by and you buy a half a cubic yard for $25. You put it into a bunch of buckets. All you need to do to break even is take home 2.5 cubic foot of that half yard, right? So even if you don't have a pickup truck and you just have buckets and a sedan, you can come by and buy any of our products by the half cubic yard. And generally speaking, if you take home a tenth of it that you paid for, you're still going to get a better deal than buying it in a plastic bag at a store. So that's always an option. Everything that you see here is also available in bulk. Yeah. All that plastic ends up at our Speedway recycling facility. Yeah. Yeah, it's all going to our facility to be baled. And then once it's baled, it goes to the plastic. Yeah. Yeah, there are options, hopefully. And the other thing about the plastic bags is in the retail space, it's very unlikely that most retailers would be willing to take an alternative material, but we are working on providing some of the products in an alternative material for those retailers that are willing to use those materials or have those in their space. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So Tank's Green Stuff products are available at most of the Ace Hardwares in town, and they're available a lot of the nurseries. Where in town do you live? Northwest side. So Marana. Okay. So you can just before Marana. Yeah, so you can go to our Ina Road land reclamation facility there. They sell it there. The Ace Hardware on Cortero sells it. The Ace Hardware on Ina, the one on Via Linda, all of them sell it. You can also find it, some of the products at Silver Bell Nursery. Trying to think, Tucson Cactus and Koi sells it over on that side of town as well. Yeah, we'll be here for the fall sale on the October 14th. 21st? Okay, someone else is the 14th, the 21st. Yeah, October 21st. Yeah. Oh, I've been waiting for this question all night long. All right. So the question was, because we accept landscape trimmings from the public, how do we know that there aren't any chemicals in the material? And the answer is we don't. At the end of the day, we really have no idea what people are putting in their landscape trimmings. But what we've done at Tank Screen Stuff is that we don't accept lawn clippings. And now the vast majority of herbicides and pesticides and any kind of agrochemical treatments are usually done on lawns, right? It's highly unlikely that they'll be on landscape trimmings like mesquites or pine trees or palo verdes. And so from there, we cut out kind of the most likely source. And then from there, we just rely on the composting process to break down any residual chemicals that might exist. And that's where the 15 days at above 131 degrees Fahrenheit is the minimum requirement set by OMRI and the USDA for breaking down any potential chemical residues in compost. Now at Tanks, we also use organic dairy manure, not because we're required to use organic dairy manure, only because we can use it, so we choose to use it. And the same kind of concept goes. You're not required to use any organic material or an organic certified material to go into the compost, as long as you're composting at that specific intensity set by the guidelines from the USDA and OMRI. But that's how we deal with it. And then we also do lab testing a couple times a year, just so I can sleep better at night, just to make sure that we are composting at the intensity that we'd like to be at. Did I answer your question? Okay. So the inoculant that we use is produced by a company technically out of Utah, and the product's called Back to Feed Microbial Soil Conditioner, or OST, organic soil treatment. And what they've done is they've learned how to culture beneficial microbiology. And originally the product was designed for agricultural field use. And what we find is when we use it in the compost, that materials break down faster, the color is richer and darker, and it allows us to introduce that much faster and make sure that our product is nothing but the best in microbiology. Now that product comes to us as a dry powder, so it comes kind of inert. We throw it into a tank of water and we aerate and bubble it to create a solution that we put out into the compost windrows.
And if you want some, it's on Amazon.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you all. Yeah, I hope so. Awesome. Should we say goodbye to the Zoom
I
folks?
think, yeah.
All right. Bye. Goodbye. Goodbye, Zoom folks. We're going to shut you down.